Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 10, Episode 16. So, what's something you want to be served when you're feeling bad? Convalescent food is different around the world and has been different in various periods, from chicken soup to Gatorade, or juke, a kind of rice porridge, to Jell-O. We're going to be talking with somebody today who's an authority on this topic. I'm speaking with Lindsay Middleton, who is a fourth-year PhD researcher at both the University of Glasgow and the University of Aberdeen. Her interdisciplinary work, The Technical Recipe, a formal analysis of 19th-century food writing, straddles both English literature and the history of technology. Using a structural analysis of the recipe genre, Lindsay investigates how food writers in the 19th century used material food technologies as a way of situating themselves in culinary histories. She has written and presented on food adulteration, narrative cookbooks, the ideology of food and thrift, and tin foods. Lindsay has published on tin foods as a disruptive technology and has publications in progress addressing food adulteration in the 1820s. She has also engaged in internship work with the National Trust for Scotland that imagines how food features in historic properties. She has a website called Dishes for the Sick Room, which is also going to be a forthcoming book on the same topic. I had a great time talking with Lindsay, who's very knowledgeable in this topic, and I really want to just take you to the conversation right now. Here we go. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with food historian Lindsay Middleton. Lindsay, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there, Dean. Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, Lindsay, I want to talk about your website and your work, but for our listeners who might not be familiar with your work or you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
Certainly. So I am a food historian and I've just finished my PhD. So I did my PhD at the University of Glasgow and the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And in my thesis, I look at 19th century recipes and cookbooks. And I'm interested in these as works of writing that are both practical but also literary. So before I started my PhD, I actually did degrees in literary analysis and Victorian literature. And I'm interested in the way that food writers use cookbooks and recipes to communicate about far more than just food instruction. So that's me. I'm based in Glasgow in Scotland, and I work at the university and food history and now more so even Scottish food history is just sort of my driving passion.
At what point in your life did you think you would start writing about food?
Again, I sort of came to it in a roundabout way, I suppose. I have always loved reading all kinds of literature, and I've always loved cooking and eating and reading cookbooks. You know, I love it when you get a good cookbook that you want to actually take and sit and read in bed rather than not necessarily cooking about it. So it was when I was doing my undergraduate degree and I was thinking about what I wanted to write my dissertation on. And I thought, hey, I could actually use my skills as a literary critic to study food. So that was the first time I kind of formally did it. And at that point, I looked at a series of 20th century cookbooks and novels. So Elizabeth David and The Debt to Pleasure by John Lanchester. And then from that point on, food has always been present in my academic studies. And it's just sort of driven by me wanting to combine my love of food and cooking with my love of reading and writing about stuff.
What are some of your earliest food memories? Do you like cooking yourself?
Yes, so I love cooking, and I'm very lucky in that I come from a family of wonderful cooks. Both my parents are excellent cooks, and so from a very young age, my siblings and I were, we got taken to lovely restaurants and cooked delicious food. One of my earliest food memories is actually a sort of funny one in that it wasn't a particularly delicious meal or anything, but when I was younger, my parents were vegetarians for a while, and my granny, my mum's mum, was not a good cook. She liked food, but she just wasn't a natural at it. And so we went round one day and she had this sort of cold rotisserie chicken that she just bought ready-made. at the supermarket, and I think I must have been about 3.5. And I just leaned over and grabbed one of these drumsticks and started chowing down on it as this vegetarian child. My mum and dad were horrified. But yeah, that was one of the sort of earliest formative memories.
I mean, I imagine you've read quite a bit of food writing yourself, but are there any food writers that personally that you really are attached to, that you really enjoy the work of?
Yes, so I think because I love food writing as a sort of form of literature more so than just a practical form, I absolutely adore writing by MFK Fisher. She's probably my favorite author of all time. I just think the way that she writes about food is absolutely beautiful, and The Gastronomical Me is a wonderful book. And then present day, I love cookbooks by Nigel Slater and Nigella Lawson and Jeremy Lee. I really like it when you're reading someone's writing about food, but actually it's very obvious how much love they have for it in the way they write. So anything that's sort of evocative and descriptive and treats food as a very personal thing is I'm a big fan of, because that's how I feel about food myself.
I love Jeremy Lee. We had him on the podcast. He's possibly the sweetest human being known to mankind.
I know I listened to that episode and he's just absolutely enchanting. And because he's also Scottish, I love his cookbooks too, because a lot of the historical references he will weave in about people like Florence Marion McNeill. They're Scottish food figures that are not as well known as they should be. So yes, big fan of Jeremy Lee.
I love his writing too. I mean, I just love reading his prose because you could tell there's a lot of love that goes into it. And that's, I think, sometimes lacking in some food writers. And it's just delicious to sit down and read. And I love to devour one of his books because he really writes so well.
Absolutely.
You have your work that is based on historical invalid recipes from Scotland. Can you talk about the scope of your work? I wanted to be careful in the intro to mangle it. And can you tell us a little bit about it and how it's evolved and kind of where it's going?
Absolutely. So this project that you're referring to is called Dishes for the Sick Room. And it was sort of a side project that came about throughout my PhD. And that it was, I got a bit of funding from the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network and the Wellcome Trust to basically investigate the correlations between food and cookery and health in Glasgow's past. And it was a wonderful project that I came to in quite a roundabout way, where I was thinking, okay, in my PhD, I have a British and global focus rather than Scottish specific, but I wanted to sort of look closer to home and see what was there. I hadn't realized until that point that Glasgow as a city has an incredibly rich history when it comes to cookery, and in particular cookery education. So one of the universities in Glasgow is called Glasgow Caledonian University, and in its history, one of the schools that it was founded on was called the Glasgow and West of Scotland College of Domestic Science. And then that school was formed in 1908, but even before that, it was based on two earlier cooking schools. So the Glasgow School of Cookery was founded in 1875, and it opened its doors in 1876. And then later on, there was also the West End School of Cookery. They became kind of competing institutions. So I was amazed that this history was sitting there. And the archives at Glasgow Caledonian University are incredible because they have all the sort of records and notes and teaching materials from when the Glasgow School of Cookery was first established, so end of the 19th century. And the other thing, so that was interesting just from a food point of view. But what was particularly interesting from the medical humanities side of things was that actually all of these historical schools had health as a sort of key concern. And the Glasgow School of Cookery was the first, in fact, it wasn't the Glasgow School of Cookery, it was when it had turned into the Glasgow and West of Scotland College of Domestic Science. It was the first institution outside of London that actually formally taught dietetics. So it was using food as a way of, educating women, because it was women who went to these schools, to cure the sick and look after the ill with food and with certain diets and certain recipes. So I really wanted to use the project just to kind of uncover those links and understand better how these historical Glaswegian schools had been quite groundbreaking, actually, in the way that they approached food and health.
I know that people during this time period, the 1800s, were, had been mindful that certain foods, would help people heal, etc. I was talking to a food historian that wrote about Californian food during this time period, and he had noted in America many food movements. Were there food movements during this time period that were noteworthy and kind of affected the popular thought on food?
Yes, absolutely. So the 19th century is a very interesting period in British food, and lots of things that we now think of kind of as common nowadays really started. So vegetarianism notably sort of really picked up as a movement, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century. And vegetarianism was something that was very explicitly linked to health, and also linked to political stances. So quite often vegetarianism was aligned with movements like the suffrage movement. And it was common for women who were advocating for the rights of other women to refuse to eat meat, because meat had all these masculine connotations of, masculine dominance, empire, physical masculinity. So vegetarian was one. Temperance was another movement that was very much tied to health. So the abstaining from alcohol, and similarly in the States, as you'll know. So those are probably the two biggest ones that I would cite. But then what's also interesting is the way that the body was understood rapidly changed very quickly over the 19th century. So we move from sort of earlier concepts of galenic and galenic humoral systems to actually understanding that organs operate independently of each other. The link between the gut and the brain, and what we understand as the microbiome, was a very key concern for 19th century physicians. And I think that's an interesting one, because we quite often think of that as a modern concern, but actually historical texts. I have a colleague, Dr. Manon Matthias, and she has shown that historically this was very much something that people were interested in. So a lot of the things that we now understand about the way our body works and the way that food affects that were being kind of not discovered, but sort of questioned and challenged in the 19th century. And you see that in cookbooks. It's really interesting. It's not just the scientific texts. These very discussions are in recipes that your sort of quote unquote everyday housewife would be using every day.
Can I expand on that a little bit? Because I think oftentimes when I talk to young people, I always have to, when we hear about history or read, we often have a hard time detaching from the current thought on things, the way we currently perceive the body. What were the thoughts during this time period that affected how people looked at like healing food or healthful food?
So the main one that's probably visible in the recipes that I've studied, and what I did was I looked at, in particular, so the College of Domestic Science published the Glasgow Cookery Book, which became a very famous publication. And it was initially just for students to use as they were being taught, but then it became a sort of commercial output, and it's got a beautiful and quite famous now purple cover, so you can still buy it. And what I did was I looked at how the invalid recipes changed between different editions that the GCU archives had. So the first one was published, I believe, in 1910, and then they have editions right up to 2009, which is a centenary edition. And I wanted to see how the invalid recipes changed over that very long lifespan of the same book. And without fail, almost all of the places where there was an invalid recipe chapter, what you can see from the recipes is that people were concerned with digestion and health. It was thought that if you were ill, you should be eating something that was as plain as possible in terms of flavoring. Certainly no sort of spice, but also the texture needed to be something that your body wouldn't have to work very hard to consume. So things like tapioca puddings or jellies or beef tea. A lot of beef tea is actually sort of the most common invalid recipe. And the thought behind that was both that it was easy to digest, but also that if you were drinking something with what we now understand as lots of protein, it was thought, the term at the time was that it was nitrogenous, and the idea was that it would build nitrogen in your body and basically help you to grow muscles and grow strong and return to health. So digestion, but also getting things into the body that were that would help you to move past an illness. That was the two driving forces. It didn't lead to a lot of appetizing food, however.
Now, I remember, I mean, I've read in many books where you inevitably will have passages where somebody will be sick and they'll give them things like beef tea or something like that. What were some of the famous or more popular restorative foods that people had that would get during this time period?
So things like, beef tea was the number one, definitely. And there are recipes for all sorts of beef tea. You would think it was fairly straightforward, but actually one of the cookbooks that I looked at had, I think it was 4 recipes for different ways of making beef tea. So one of them, which always stood out as kind of horrifying to me, was for raw beef tea. And the idea with that one, the idea with that one was that you just took bits of raw beef and you put it in cold water, and that was it. And you let it steep for a few hours, and then you would drink it, which just seems not good.
Yeah, that's wrong.
No, it is wrong. I mean, beef tea in itself is not the most appetizing thing. But yeah, so aside from beef tea, things like arrowroot puddings, lots of sort of grains and flours that would be combined with milk and sugar and then either baked or just eaten in a sort of set pudding form. There was lots of invalid jellies. So you could have an invalid milk jelly, which was sort of milk and gelatin, maybe a wee bit of sugar. Sometimes they would put a bit of like food coloring in it to make it more appealing. Or there would be things like calf's foot jelly, which is your more traditional spick type jelly. So yeah, lots of things that were very bland and wobbly.
What were some of the biggest surprises and discoveries that you, outside of the raw beef tea, what are some of the biggest surprises that kind of maybe shocked you?
I think one of the things that really shocked me, particularly looking at the Glasgow cookery book, was that, so before the centenary edition was published in 2009, the college had made a centenary edition in 1975. So we have that gap between 1910 and 1975. And I expected there to be far more variation in the way that invalid recipes were actually presented in these texts. But what really surprised me was actually, despite the sort of years and the changes and the fact that at this point in the early 20th century, food is really becoming far more processed, I suppose you would say. People are starting to buy ready meals. Microwaves become a thing. It's food changed a lot in that time, but the invalid recipes largely stayed the same. So there was still recipes for beef tea. There was still the same jellies, like carrot green jelly was always there. So that kind of proliferation of a core catalogue of invalid recipes shocked me. And actually, I suppose it does make sense because, I speak to people sometimes of an older generation, like my grandpa, for instance, and he will still eat things like arrowroot pudding, which I don't know but generationally that it's still there. There were changes that you could tie to specific moments. So at one point in the 60s, there's the addition of recipes for diabetics. And they were ones that started using things like stevia instead of sugar, so artificial sweeteners. And that was an interesting coincidence with the sort of rise of diet culture and stuff like that. So, but yes, I think the thing that shocked me was how little actually things changed over time.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. I've seen a resurgence in some things, like for instance, I don't know, here in America, we've had this huge resurgence of people drinking broth or it's become a big thing now. People are selling it. It's very expensive,
Yeah.
which is weird for me because I guess I'm old enough that it seems odd. But like that's the thing that I'm seeing, resurgence of, or people are seeing the health benefits of broth. Have you seen like anything where they had it right and they were kind of doing something that later on we're like seeing it as a new thing, but it really is very old?
Yes, I mean, I think you're right. Broth is a great example. I remember a few years ago seeing a chef come out with this like recipe for bone broth, and it was just your typical, making soup or making
Yeah,
broth after you've roasted a bit of meat. And I had the exact same reaction where I was like, well, this isn't, they packaged it as this sort of new shiny thing, but it's been done for hundreds of years. And I think I always find this interesting, perhaps in a non-British context, with things like fermented foods,
yeah,
and the uptick of interest in things that are fermented or drinks like kombucha, these things that are really ancient in terms of practice, but they
yeah.
seem to kind of get picked up and become really trendy again. Similarly, like, I don't know if it was the same where you are, but when lockdown happened here, I did it too, but everyone started baking sourdough.
Yeah, and I'm guilty of that myself. Yeah,
Yeah. And it was a good thing to do because the process was interesting and it required you to become invested, and you do become very invested in your my starter is making me feel guilty at the moment. It's very dormant in my fridge, but things like that sort of it's so interesting to see how they're almost on a kind of wheel of time when it comes to their presence in the past.
can you? I was very captivated by your GCU archive. Can you talk a little bit about the archive and that you did the work for this for your
Yeah,
work
so
on?
this is I undertook the project sort of in collaboration with the Glasgow Archive Centre. So the librarian and university archivist there, Carol McCallum, was incredibly helpful because she's sort of been looking after the collections for a long time, and she could point me in the right directions and sort of say what was useful. So I went and I used to go into the archive centre, and I basically just dig around and try and see. I looked at a variety of different things. So there were all the editions of the Glasgow cookbook, which were really interesting. The other things that were fascinating were the sort of notes and logbooks almost that recorded all the meetings that the women that ran these schools have, because through those notes, which are meticulously taken, it's an archivist, it's a historian's dream. Like, every conversation is there. You can see how thoughts developed. So when they became interested in doing the dietetics and sick nursing degree, you can kind of see how that develops in real time through the meetings. And then the other things that are wonderful is they have some of the student materials, so you can actually see what was being taught and how. And I love, just for me, one of my favorite things about historical cookbooks is the kind of tangibility of history through them. So, whether it's someone has clipped out a wee newspaper clipping of a recipe and stuck it in there, or scribbled a note beside a recipe, changing a measurement. And because the Glasgow Cookery Book was initially used as a teaching aid for students, a lot of the additions that they have in the collections, which have come to them in various ways, they either had them already or people will find one that belonged to a relative and bring it in. So one of the lovely things was the variety in the handwritten notes between these cookbooks. I found one, and it was this woman. So the cookbooks had note sections at the back, and they were really well populated. And I found one where a woman had a whole list of wedding cakes, and it was like cake for Mrs. Thompson, or cake for Mrs. Middleton, or whatever it happened to be. And it was clear that she was a really good baker and obviously made wedding cakes for people. And one of the recipes was really interesting in it because it listed soya in the cake recipe instead of almonds, like soy flour. And I was like, okay, this is bizarre, because it was in the 1940s and I was like, okay, is she trying to make it vegan? Because again, my contemporary mind is jumping to conclusions. But when I actually ended up asking Twitter, and a friend who's a food historian of mine, who's a friend of mine, Kevin Geddes, he got back to me and he said, oh, I think this is because of rationing. And he then got out a Marguerite Patton cookbook, recipes for wartime, I think it was, and sure enough, there it was. It was a replacement for ground almonds because they couldn't get ground almonds. So I just love that the cookbooks and the recipes are interesting in itself, but when you actually get into sitting in the archive, you can look at all those extra bits and the patterns of use that really make cookbooks as items very personal.
In your research, have you found any favorite recipes that you like to use, that you might use from this time period?
That's a good question. And often I sit back and reflect on why I chose the 19th century, because a lot of the stuff that I look at is not overly appetizing. So in my PhD, one of my chapters is about tinned foods. And I love tinned foods as an object of study, but I love tinned foods to eat now today, but a tin of lovely fish from Portugal that I might eat today is not the same as a tin of beef from the 19th century. So I guess certain things always proliferate. A lot of the sort of French-inspired dishes by writers like Alexis Soyer will always be delicious because it's just good food. One of my other favorite authors from the 19th century is a woman called Agnes Marshall, and her whole thing, she was pioneering in terms of ice cream and ice desserts, and her ice cream recipes are excellent. I've never tried one that one didn't work and two wasn't delicious. So I tend to, I'll go for the things that I know are good. A lot of the more grotesque or jellied or things that would involve me very antisocially boiling a part of an animal for hours at a time, I tend to avoid those ones.
Aside from being helpful, during this time period, weren't jellies kind of popular? Weren't they in vogue?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And not just so your typical like calf's foot jelly was an invalid recipe, but what was even better was like display jellies. So you get things like a recipe for a fish pond, and the idea is it's a clear jelly with fish or things that are made to look like fish suspended in it, things that look like other things, so like follies, you would have a plate and it would look like it had bacon and eggs on it, but actually it was made of jelly. So certainly, I mean, this was a very upper middle class thing to do, because you needed to be able to pay someone who had the time and nothing better to do than to create something ridiculous out of jelly. But yes, they were very popular, and I'm actually considering, so I have my PhD examination in this month actually, and I'm actually considering whether I should make something strange in jelly to bring along to it.
That would definitely get their attention, I think.
Yeah.
I've talked to many people who work on research projects, and in your case, like theirs, in many cases, they have kind of a media presence. Now, this seems like a topic that many people would be very happy to give you input on. Have you been getting people giving you input and sending you information, maybe octogenarians talking about stuff from their childhood?
I mean, it's something I wish I could do in a more formalized way, because absolutely, like, I find as soon as people find out that I study and research food, they always have something to tell me. And I've done some work with the National Trust for Scotland, where I sort of helped them to display food in a certain way in their property, and I wrote a food tour for a property in Edinburgh called Gladstone's Land. And people love hearing about historical food because it creates sort of a tangible link to the past. But no, I mean, on Twitter, I've made Twitter is probably the best for me in terms of networking, but unfortunately not everyone's on Twitter, and they might not always see you if they are. So one idea I would love to kind of investigate is a way of gathering that generational knowledge, because I think, especially now that everything is so much more online, there's a risk that the sort of traditional forms of circulating things like recipes or cooking practices, whether that was people having recipe notebooks or just actually spending the time in the kitchen between generations, I think there's a risk that might get lost or could get lost. So if there was some way to, yes, as you say, get everyone in a room and hear what they used to eat when they were little, it would be absolutely fascinating. But no, I'm always interested in hearing people's food stories, because you learn so much.
I used to work with a lot of thesis writers, and many of them had this common problem where in doing the research, many subtopics keep popping up, and they find things they want to do also. Have you found any subtopics that you think you might want to work on in the future?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, especially as I'm like now finished my PhD. I'm thinking about what I want to do going forwards. And when I was doing my work with the National Trust, I realized that actually there's quite a big gap in our knowledge of Scottish food history, certainly in comparison with England. It can, aside from the sort of bigger, well-known types of food, things like haggis, whiskey, aside from our kind of biggest exports, actually there's not much in the way of good history on Scottish food. So I would love to spend some time really digging into things, because we're a tiny country, but there's massive variation in what people eat, depending on the climate of where they live, depending on seasons. And I think it's a really interesting question going forwards as we are forced to re-examine our food chains, because as you know, things like the pandemic have shown, it's actually very precarious to rely so much on food from the rest of the world. And actually, in my work on tinned foods, that was a sort of big moment where global food chains were sort of industrialized in a way that meant a massive increase of food moving around the world. But the same problems in terms of food supply and feeding populations that we are facing now were exactly what people in the 19th century were talking about. So I think moving into a closer Scottish context would be great. I actually inherited an archive. Well, it's not a huge archive. It's a sort of bag for life size collection of recipes from a friend, one of my mum's friends' grannies, and it's got some really cool stuff in it, all these sort of pamphlets and the ephemera that normally gets chucked away. So I'm considering maybe writing my way or blogging my way through that as a starting point. So that's what's bubbling away in my mind at the moment.
Do you mind talking about Scottish food for a moment? Because I'm very captivated by it. I've read many cookbooks, and I often cringe when Americans they leap to the term, they leap to haggis immediately, which always makes me cringe, because I'm sure that people get sick of that when you're from Scotland. Like, you meet somebody probably and they're like, "Oh, haggis," and you're like, "Oh, would you shut the hell up?" But and I've eaten
Yeah.
haggis, and I like haggis, but it's pretty unremarkable. I don't know why people really go on about it. What would you
Yeah.
think would typify Scottish food, really?
So, I mean, yeah, the haggis there is a bit of an eye roll moment. And I think haggis actually testifies to how good advertising and branding works. And that's mainly been done through Robert Burns. But
Yeah.
aside from a Burns supper, in fact, a Burns supper is probably the only time I eat haggis a year. And I like it too as a food. But as you say, every country in the world has some sort of offal and oatmeal type sausage or pudding because it was the food of poor people. So it's not actually that unique.
Yeah, we have scrapple.
Yeah. Oh, scrapple. I've not heard of that before.
It's pretty much kind of the same thing,
Yeah, because it was a good way of using your whole animal and getting as much out of it as possible. But yeah, so for me, Scottish food is actually just what typifies Scottish food, or good Scottish food for me, is the produce and the variety of produce we have. So our seafood and shellfish and fish and the kind of remaining historical ways that we treat them, which I hope never die out, are very Scottish for me. So things like our broth smokies, which are things like that, Cullen skink, and Aberdeen Angus beef, and actually I think we have big similarities climate wise to places like Denmark, but and they have in recent years done an amazing job of actually being like, okay, let's look at what's around us and start using it and giving it the value that it deserves. But it's not quite happened at the same level as Scotland. So yeah, I think great produce is one thing. And I also think certainly in places like Glasgow, there's a kind of multiculturalism to Scottish food that is wonderful. So people quite often talk about Glasgow as being the place where chicken tikka masala was invented. And whilst that's certainly probably a difficult thing to prove or claim, there's a big, for me, Scottish food is sort of about the idea of being around a hearth and sharing with people you love and eating good food while you do so.
Lindsay, what's next for you?
What's next for me? Good question. So yeah, well, at the moment I'm thinking about how I might turn my thesis into a book. I think food presents a really interesting thing from an academic standpoint, in that you can either keep it very academic, but actually food works best when you're talking about it with everyone. And in my own work, I've always gotten the most out of conversations that are outside of the library or outside of an archive. So I think, hopefully there will be a book in the future from the thesis, and then I want to put more time into this Scottish food project, because I think that has important resonances, both from a historical perspective, but also for how we move forward as a country in terms of food. So it's lots of big things to think about. But yes, probably mucking around with strange Scottish recipes and it's going to be the next phase.
I look forward to that. Lindsay, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
That was my conversation with Lindsay Middleton. We have links to her website in the bio. Please check that out. You won't be disappointed. Next week, we're going to be talking with another food historian, Becky Diamond. Her forthcoming book, Gilded Age Cookbook, covers information and lore about the food culture of the 1800s. We can also talk about her other books as well. Check that conversation out next week. I hope you're all having a wonderful week, and maybe you're cooking some recipes from some of the cookbooks that were featured on the program. I hope you all have a great week. Tune in next week to my next guest. Until then, keep on cooking.